Continuing debate, the honourable member for New Brunswick Southwest.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'd like to begin my remarks this evening by thanking our Speaker for yesterday's ruling on the question of privilege from the honourable member for Wellington-Halton Hills. This was an important moment, an important decision, because it brought into sharp focus the intimidation by foreign agents operating in Canada. And even tonight, the House, a day later, is still gripped by this decision, and that, I think, is relevant to members that are participating here tonight and have participated up until now on this question. As a past member of the Canada-China Special Committee, I know from the evidence submitted to Parliament that the member for Wellington-Halton Hills isn't the only Canadian to be targeted. At committee, we heard from Canadians, particularly from Canadians of Chinese ancestry, about tactics used by the Chinese Communist Party to intimidate and silence our democracy. We've witnessed over the past 2 decades how Beijing's Communist Party revealed itself not only to be at odds with international laws and norms, but opposed to accountability, opposed to openness, and even opposed to the basic rights of people, including mainland China's own citizens. Like a few other members of Parliament and many hundreds of thousands of Canadians, I've had the pleasure and privilege of living in Hong Kong. That territory is an amazing place, and I was fortunate enough to be on hand for the handover from Britain's rule to the People's Republic of China on July 1st, 1997. It was a heavy moment with feelings of both apprehension and opportunity. Afterwards, I visited Asia frequently from Canada, once I returned to Canada a year later, and I have fond memories of both rural and urban mainland China, energetic Hong Kong, and even remote Tibet. Today, sadly, I would not travel to any part of mainland China. And this saddens me because I have deep affection for the Chinese people. One cannot travel for days or weeks or months at a time and leave untouched by their hospitality, fondness for family, tradition, and, of course, remarkable cuisine. As well, I admire deeply China's culture and long history of struggle, perseverance, and many great accomplishments. However, I know that traveling to mainland China is something I cannot do anymore. Because of my committee work in Parliament, I am today prohibited by Beijing from entering that country. As well, it's because I have also called for a free and democratic China. And because of that, I'm in violation of Beijing's draconian national security law. Now, I uttered these words that I believe China would be better served by being democratic, by directly electing its leaders. I said these words on Canadian soil and in Parliament. Yet the national security law, according to the regime in Beijing, applies anywhere around the world. And by uttering those words, a call for democracy in China, I've broken that law. Now, I view it as an immoral law, but as we saw with the 2 Michaels who were arrested and detained, that means nothing when you're faced with the dictators in Beijing. I know that many members on this side of the chamber, and probably a good many that have served with the government since 2015, would never have believed that it could take the government of Canada 2 years to expel a foreign diplomat sent here by Beijing's Communist Party, who planned and executed an intimidation and harassment campaign against the family and loved ones of a fellow parliamentarian and our colleague, the member from Wellington-Halton Hills. Yet it happened, and this is a Liberal disgrace, and it must be investigated. I want to take a moment to repeat some remarks from the member from Wellington Halton Hills when he addressed the House last week and provided the basis for our ongoing debate. He noted that on March 6, 2012, our then Speaker rightly said, and I quote, "Those who enter political life fully expect to be held accountable for their actions to their constituents and to those who are concerned with issues and initiatives they may advocate. In a healthy democracy, vigorous debate on issues is encouraged. In fact, the rules and procedures of this House are drafted to allow for proponents and opponents to discuss in a respectful manner even the most difficult and sensitive of matters. However, when duly elected members are personally threatened for their work in Parliament, whether introducing a bill, making a statement, or casting a vote, this House must take this matter very seriously." End quote. And so it is right for this to be debated. It is important that the Committee on Procedure and House Affairs investigate, and it is necessary that Parliament get to the bottom of this and discovers the truth. CSIS discovered, as reported by the Globe and Mail, that multiple members of Parliament have been targeted by Beijing's Communist Party. And indeed, this privilege motion that we're debating, as we see on our screens, intimidation campaign against members of Parliament. Who would have thought that such a debate would be necessary in Canada, or that we would be tasked with discovering what happened? And members of all parties in the House of Commons should be questioning why the government was so keen to permit a foreign diplomat sent here by Beijing to remain here and continue intimidating and threatening the family and loved ones of not only a parliamentarian, but several parliamentarians, it seems, as well as Canadians across this country. Either the government takes prompt measures to uphold our rights and protect Canadians from harassment, or foreign nations that wish to undermine us, do us harm, will double down and threaten more and more Canadians. Yet, whenever it comes to issues relating to Beijing's Communist Party, this Prime Minister does not feel any urgency to act. Deflect, deny, blame, and do nothing unless absolutely forced to by opposition parties and ultimately Canadian voters. We see this with the Uyghur genocide recognition motion that the Prime Minister and his cabinet abstained from when the vote was held in this Parliament. We see this with the Winnipeg Lab document leak motion that the Prime Minister and his cabinet voted against, and to this day is still buried. It's an issue that is meant to be resolved by a special working group of parliamentarians working with an oversight committee to release documents, but that has disappeared. One more issue this government prefers to sweep under the rug. We see this with the Prime Minister and his decisions not to apologize for the comments made by several Liberals in this chamber that the member for Wellington Halton Hills knew about the threats against his family and loved ones and did nothing. A disgraceful misrepresentation meant to obscure what had happened. And the government's response to these allegations, the allegation in the Globe and Mail, has been evasive and inconsistent, with simple questions about their knowledge of the situation going unanswered. This all raises additional concerns about transparency and accountability. At first, the government announced that anyone violating the Vienna Convention would be expelled. So we waited. Days passed without new information or an expulsion. Later, the Prime Minister claimed to be unaware of the allegations until they actually appeared in the newspaper, asserting that the same applied to other executive branch members in his cabinet. He also mentioned that CSIS determined the issue wasn't significant enough to warrant escalation and still no expulsions took place. The narrative shifted again when it was revealed that the security briefings did not even leave CSIS, that they did not reach the National Security Advisor and other government departments. The government maintained, yet of course we discovered that they had reached the highest echelons of the public service, and the government was somehow in the dark. And despite no expulsions occurring, the government raised concerns about possible consequences of expelling a People's Republic of China diplomat, leading to questions about their intentions and resolve. More false accusations were made against a member for Wellington Halton Hills, with the Prime Minister participating in the attempts to undermine his credibility and the seriousness of the CSIS reports. Mr. Speaker, it was all and remains a bloody mess. For these reasons and others, it is imperative Parliament must explore the violation of our privileges and the threat of election interference through the Standing Committee on Procedure and House Affairs. Leaving this to the government bench alone is without question the wrong move. They simply can't be trusted. It is why Conservatives also continue to call for an independent public inquiry into Beijing's foreign interference in our election. There are so many inconsistencies that have surrounded the Liberal government's handling of the situation that it is right to question their judgment. For example, it is just not credible to believe CSIS would brief the member for Wellington Halton Hills on a serious issue of interference and intimidation without informing the national security apparatus and the political level of this government. Of course, this was recently corroborated by Sherry Henderson, who is Assistant Director for Requirements at CSIS, who said at the Standing Committee on Procedure and House Affairs that, and I quote, "I can say that we definitely have seen specific cases of hostile activities of states against politicians. In those specific cases, we definitely brief our government on the challenges that are being faced," end quote. So to be clear, the government's pattern of obfuscating information from parliamentarians has been evident in previous scandals, such as the SNC-Lavalin debacle, the We Charity scandal, and just last week with the Trudeau Foundation. So why would anyone think this situation is any different? In the debate, significant lies in the need for the Procedure and House Affairs Committee to address the issue, as well as the Ethics Committee's focus on foreign interference. Despite multiple committees investigating foreign interference, the government has not initiated an independent inquiry, and it should immediately. An independent public inquiry would help assess the impact of Beijing's communist regime interference in Canada. Our former colleague, Kenny Chiu, has discussed the fear and intimidation tactics employed by Chinese mainland officials in Beijing, including misinformation and disinformation campaigns against members of the House during recent elections. Mehmet Todi, a leading advocate for the human rights of Uyghur Muslims in Canada, shared his experience of Beijing communist officials monitoring his calls to relatives in China in an attempt to intimidate him. And there is still an unknown number of Chinese Communist Party police stations operating in Canada. These serve one purpose, and that is to intimidate citizens and landed immigrants who live here in what should be free and democratic Canada. There is a pattern of pandering to Beijing which appears to have begun when the Prime Minister won the Liberal Party leadership. A large donation was soon made to the Trudeau Foundation at the time, and questions have arisen about the receipt issued for the donation. And parliamentary committees are studying that as well, urging the CRA to investigate that and to get to the bottom of any undue influence on our democracy and on the Prime Minister. This pattern of influence must be investigated further because it undermines democratic institutions, the electoral process, and, of course, faith in our democracy. At the same time, it is important to recognize that many Chinese Canadians live in our country in fear and may not participate fully in the electoral process due potential retribution. And that is where we are today. Our government and Prime Minister took 2 years to act and expel a diplomat for meddling in Canada's democracy. And because the Liberals finally declared one diplomat from Communist China not welcome in this country, they think they should be congratulated after waiting 2 years. Yet Liberals had ample evidence of Beijing's diplomats interfering in elections, particularly from its Toronto and Vancouver offices. Yet, when questioned about this at the Procedure and House Affairs Committee, the Foreign Affairs Minister claimed there was no evidence. But they did possess evidence about a foreign diplomat sent here by Beijing's Communist Party, which had been known for 2 years. They might claim the information never made it to the Prime Minister's desk. And that's why we need an investigation to find out what happened. But if that is true, that is still their responsibility. If this Liberal government is not capable of overseeing the security of this country, they should be held in contempt for their inability to govern well and responsibly. It took a report from the Globe and Mail and pressure from the opposition and Canadians at large for them to finally act. Why this long delay? Why this long delay? It is unacceptable for Beijing diplomats to facilitate funding for political candidates, to target Conservative candidates, or any candidates for that matter in this country, and then to boast about defeating disliked incumbent MPs. It is equally intolerable for them to organize illegal police stations, to harass and intimidate Chinese Canadians, and to threaten MPs and their families. Canada has a long-standing commitment to accountable government. We must uphold and preserve that. Canadians should be informed of the recent security lapses. Instead, the Prime Minister continues to put electoral decisions ahead of national security. And this is the most serious failing of anyone who occupies the government benches under this Liberal government. Thank you very much.
Questions and comments? Questions et commentaires? L'honorable député de Longueuil-Saint-Hubert.
Madame la Présidente, c'est un drôle de débat, le débat sur l'ingérence étrangère. Je trouve qu'il y a comme un sentiment, on flotte. C'est comme si on avait tous un peu, enfin le gouvernement surtout, des lunettes roses par rapport à l'ingérence chinoise. Tu sais, ça fait comme des mois que ça dure. Là, la pointe de l'iceberg, ça a été, il y a un élu ici qui s'est fait harceler, ou enfin les gens de sa famille se sont fait harceler par l'État chinois, mais dans les derniers mois, il y a eu, tu sais, on a vu passer des ballons chinois au-dessus de l'Amérique du Nord. On n'a jamais trop su ce qui est arrivé avec ça. On a interdit TikTok. TikTok était dans nos téléphones. Tous et chacun ici était dans nos téléphones. Il y a eu un cas d'espionnage aussi chez Hydro-Québec, au Québec. Hydro-Québec, qui est quand même une société importante. Ben, on apprenait qu'il y avait un espion chinois qui travaillait pour eux autres. Les postes de police chinois, comment on peut tolérer des centres communautaires où l'État chinois vient faire des pressions sur des Canadiens ici, avec leur famille là-bas? Il y a comme un sentiment... La situation est très grave. Puis on dirait que le gouvernement, à l'autre bord, s'en rend pas trop compte. Je veux juste savoir, mon collègue, est-ce qu'il pense pas vraiment qu'en ce moment, on a tous un peu des lunettes roses par rapport à ce qu'un État comme la Chine, aussi puissant que la Chine, vienne intervenir ici au Canada?
The honourable member for New Brunswick Southwest.
Merci beaucoup. Madame la Présidente, je suis tout à fait d'accord avec le membre opposé. Je pense que c'est une question très sérieuse que le gouvernement ne prend pas sérieux. This is something that I think the government has known about for far too long and has preferred to turn the other way, to ignore it, either because it wasn't capable of dealing with this, wasn't willing to make some of the tough decisions that are required to ensure Canadians remain safe. But there's no doubt it is a mess and is one that has unfolded slowly. This did not just appear one day, but it is story upon story, and we must get to the bottom of it.
Comments? The honourable member for London Fanshawe.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. And I wanted to thank the honourable member for his speech. At the beginning, he talked about the incredible beauty and hospitality and kindness of the people in the country of China when he was visiting there. And then he spoke, of course, about the need for the public inquiry. And I am always concerned. I certainly hear this from people in my area that are from that are of Chinese descent and background, Chinese Canadians. They've been standing up against the racism, the discrimination that they've experienced because a lot of this uncertainty. Could he talk about the fact and the point that within a public inquiry, we could actually get to the bottom of a lot of this and actually help a lot of to fight against that anti-Asian racism? Thank you, Madam Speaker.
The member for New Brunswick Southwest.
Well, thank you for the question. I think the point is spot on, and that is one of the benefits of having a proper public consultation. We will hear from the public, and more Canadians will come to realize the primary target of mainland China, the communist regime, has been Canadians of Chinese heritage. Those are the people who are not able to fulfill their democratic rights because of intimidation from police stations that operate here illegally, from intimidation tactics from Beijing's diplomats. So I appreciate the question. It's a great point. We want to make sure this is about the regime in Beijing, and we will hear from Canadians of Chinese descent who will reinforce that message, that they too support democracy and freedoms that are the bedrock of this country.
Comments? The honourable member Sherwood Park, Fort Saskatchewan.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. And I want to just say it was a pleasure to work with this member on the Special Committee on Canada-China Relations in the last Parliament. I think we've got a lot of important work done. In particular, we began a study that was interrupted by the election highlighting the national security threats that were associated with Canada's relationship with the PRC. And what struck me about some of the work we did at the time was just to see how many everyday Canadians are impacted by these threats and these instances of foreign interference. And the member for Wellington Halton Hills has recognized as well that as he faces these threats, he has a position that allows him to bring attention to them. But many people have suffered in silence. There are many stories that we have heard, but many stories we will never hear of people that have been victims of foreign interference and have not been able to get the attention to the situation that should have been brought to it. So I wonder if the member has thoughts and reflections on, as we address this privilege issue involving members of Parliament, how we can stand with everyday Canadians who face worse threats and don't have the same opportunities.
For New Brunswick Southwest.
Another excellent question that I think deserves a brief answer. That is to give them a platform to speak, to give these Canadians that have faced intimidations and threats from Beijing a platform through Parliament and the Canadian government, the opportunity to stand up and be heard. That, I think, would do more to help rectify this situation and correct the many errors that this government made. And don't forget, I'll remind my colleagues here, that the Liberal government actually sued the Speaker prior to the last election to prevent information that the Canada-China Committee had discovered. An outrageous move to protect itself and not ensure that Canadians had the truth. Thank you.
L'honorable député de Drummond.
Merci, Madame la Présidente. Je fais écho un peu à mon collègue de Longueuil-Saint-Hubert tantôt qui parlait de cette espèce de climat où on a l'impression que les gens ont des lunettes roses. Moi, je sens plutôt un climat d'inquiétude. Ça me préoccupe de voir comment ce gouvernement-là, Madame la Présidente, traite ces questions qui sont d'une gravité presque jamais vue dans notre histoire. Je me souviens de We Charity il y a quelques années, à quel point ils ont essayé de tout camoufler, ils ont essayé de repousser ça en dessous du tapis continuellement jusqu'à ce que, finalement, à force de travailler, les journalistes et députés d'opposition ont fini par dévoiler que c'était épouvantable, c'était encore pire que ce qu'on pensait au début. Là, on se retrouve dans des allégations d'ingérence chinoise, puis plus on gratte, plus on trouve des affaires qui n'ont pas de bon sens, et malgré ça, les libéraux et leurs amis de la Fondation Pierre-Éliott Trudeau continuent de se mettre les mains devant les yeux, un sac sur la tête. Bref, il n'y a rien qui s'est passé, eux font rien de tout croche. Alors que c'est quelque chose de tellement grave qu'il faudrait faire preuve de transparence et collaborer pour mettre ça au jour puis pour rassurer la population. Moi, je trouve que c'est un climat qui est extrêmement inquiétant. J'aimerais entendre mon collègue là-dessus.
The honourable for New Brunswick Southwest.
Again, I could not agree more. Our strength as a country and a democracy rests on our openness. The weakness of the communist regime is its insistence on lies and to keep things hidden. And we must, as a democracy, ensure that what has happened is known by Canadians so they can hold those that failed in their duty accountable, and ensure we have a government here that will stand up for the interests of this country and voters right across the country.
Comments, questions et commentaires? L'honorable député de Abitibi-Témiscamingue.
Merci, Madame la Présidente. Évidemment, dans ce débat-là, comme député, moi, je suis très inquiet sur l'état de la démocratie. Est-ce que mon collègue peut dire s'il ressent de la pression, s'il se sent menacé et quel impact serait sur lui et sa capacité d'exercer son rôle de député? Comme on sait, il y a plusieurs circonscriptions qui ont été ciblées. Si ça avait été son cas, comment il serait capable de jouer son rôle en toute indépendance, Madame la Présidente, parce que fondamentalement, c'est donc notre démocratie qui est attaquée et l'intégrité de cette Chambre. Merci, Madame la Présidente.
New Brunswick Southwest.
Merci beaucoup encore. Moi, jusqu'à date, non. Moi, je peux faire mon travail ici sans problème chez moi. Mais écoute, on a des exemples, comme Kenny Chu, qui était un député ici, dans la Chambre des communes, qui était au bout des attaques de Beijing, de Pékin, pardon. Alors, on a des exemples très graves où on a des députés qui ne sont plus ici parce que les communistes ont travaillé pour être sûrs et certains qu'ils ont perdu et ne pouvaient pas retourner ici pour battre pour leur politique chez eux. Alors, c'est très, très grave. On entend le gouvernement qui dit que ça n'a pas influencé les élections, ça ne changerait pas grand-chose, mais il y a quand même des députés qui ne sont pas ici à cause des communistes.